The Infiniti G35 is the most understated, misrepresented, also sometimes pile of junk car you could possibly jump into. I'm Alex Martini. Welcome to Martini Works, where we help people mod their car, and we are dissecting, you and me together, for another 20-minute episode where we get to talk about the Infiniti G35. If you've been on the fence about owning one, or maybe you own one and you're looking to know more before you jump into modifying it, welcome. This is going to be a video for you. Hopefully this information is valuable and not completely useless, even though I say it is useless. So if you're making dinner, let me know how it goes. And if you want a pro tip on your ramen, you need to start including egg. You need to start including a little bit of chicken from a rotisserie, and you'd be a 10 out of 10, which, by the way, we're not here to talk about ramen meals, even though I'm the best maker in all of Wisconsin, and I'm willing to own that. Here's what I am to say, though. If you do have a G35, modify your car with us here at martiniworks.com. We can mount and balance wheel and tire packages. We can ship them to your door, performance parts, intakes, and exhausts as well. We just got Yokohama, Nexen, Michelin, and Ironman tires on the website as well, which I think is very cool, which means you can actually get a drift set, you can get a track set, you can also get a 200 treadwear set of wheels and tires now, which I think is absolutely bang on. With that being said, if you think we're gonna have more questions at the end, drop them in the comments below. We're answering as many as we possibly can. And if you want us to cover a different car, feel free to let us know that too. So with that being said, let's start back at the history. So it was released in 2003 to the US. The G35 was actually one of my dream cars as a tween, if you will. I remember seeing one and thinking that it looked an awful lot like a JDM Skyline, even though I didn't really know what that was at the time, which we're gonna get into why there's so much confusion around the nameplate of this car. But the coupe was, in many people's eyeballs, considered the best looking car at the time because Infiniti borrowed a lot of the Skyline design structure and moved the car to an exclusively rear wheel drive configuration that was really built for the United States. And it was kind of a match made in heaven. If you look at a stock or the old photos of the Infiniti G35 before somebody absolutely destroyed it at 200,000 miles, they're really good looking cars. Like, everything about them I think looks fantastic. And I would even argue to say a G35 coupe manual looks better than a Nissan 350Z. That's just my opinion. Take it if you want to. But to make sure that this car did well, specifically in the United States and with the growing Japanese influence, especially in the sport tuner segment from the 90s, they had a man by the name of Hiroshi Hasegawa design the exterior. This is the same exact person who is responsible for designing the GTR, which is why I think the G35 carries some of that similar styling, particularly in that rear 3/4 angle that a lot of people love. The front G35 I think is a little subtle and maybe not my favorite look. I think it's just a little bit too luxury looking, but the rear end of these cars is an incredible design. I think something about them just speaks to it. The weird arches, the lower the car, all of it looks super good. The taillights, even the OEM taillights, I think look killer. It's a good looking car. So why does the G35 feel different? Well, the story goes that if you remember back in the early 2000s, there was a CEO of Nissan. His name was Carlos Ghosn, or Ghosn. He was, by all intents and purposes, probably one of the greatest CEOs of all time in the automotive industry until he was the worst CEO of all time in automotive history. There's a whole story about Carlos and how he evaded prison and capture. That's a whole different story. He snuck out of a box that looked like it was for music equipment until he got out of Japan, because he was under house arrest for embezzling and all sorts of trouble and all sorts of charges that he claims were untrue, that it was all a coup by the Nissan board of directors. Carlos Ghosn was known for one really good thing. He was good at getting Nissan back on track, which meant he made a lot of enemies, particularly in his early years at Nissan. He was a formidable CEO. He cut and cut and cut anywhere he possibly could so that Nissan could actually go back to making a profit. Because while they were good at making cars like R34 GTR and R33 GTR and things like that, they were not very good at making mass-produced capable cars to actually make the company any money. SUVs, they couldn't do very well. Non-sport sedans, they couldn't do very well. Non-sport coupes, they couldn't do very well. They couldn't sell internationally very well. And Carlos came on board and really helped get the company to turn around and start doing better instead of relying on buyouts from other manufacturers. Long way of saying he was known as Le Cost Killer. That was his nickname. So he found the Skyline wasn't really being made in a sufficient amount of volume to justify the fact that it had so many unique parts. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to combine the Skyline platform, the non-GTR, with the platform of the Gloria, the Cedric, and the Stagia, which is the estate version of the Skyline. And then he wanted to split off the 350Z and the GTR platform from the Skyline platform. So essentially you had two houses of parts for these cars. Essentially, instead of it just being, hey, here's a Skyline and the GTR and here's all of this stuff that they share, let's make the Skyline parts similar to the Stagia parts, similar to the Cedric and the Gloria parts. So then that way, one tie rod could be used for 5 cars instead of one tie rod being used for 1 car. And this began to differentiate the GTR chassis from the Skyline chassis. And essentially what happened with that, the Skyline lost its unique platform and inline-6 design, particularly once we got past the R34 and into what this kind of mixed era before the R35 came around. So that's why you see the G35 not carrying an inline-6 engine. You see it carrying a V6 engine. It's more commonplace, it's easier to get power, it's more reliable, it's cheaper, and you also get a couple other bits and pieces that you start to share with the Cedric and Gloria and things like that. So did it launch well? And again, we're gonna get back to the Infinity Skyline name. And the answer is yeah. So it looked radically different at the time. In the early 2000s, a lot of cars were just trying to look like the 3 Series. The 3 Series had a stranglehold on this like European sports car segment, and everyone was trying to compete with it. You had the Acura TL competing with it. You had the B6 and B7 Audi competing with it. You had the Lexus IS competing with it. And they all had this little thing that was just so similar to the 3 Series. It just kind of felt like everybody was making their version of that. But the G35 was very much a very unique looking car for the segment. Number one, it really shined in the fact that it had a manual transmission, and it really shined that it came in at 282 horsepower out of the coupe, which was pretty sick considering that the sedans got 260, but you compare it to a TL or you compare it to a 3 Series, and you're pumping out some very serious numbers for a car that was competitive in price and looked very different. So, launched well, did so well that it actually caused some issues at Infiniti and Nissan as well, which is why we're gonna get into some of the common questions around this platform. If you're looking to buy this car, you're either wondering why the hell is it so cheap on the marketplace? Why are people calling it a Skyline? And why are they takeover cars? They used to not be that. They used to be a super well-respected car. There were so many people that if you were to type in Infinity G35, they'd say versus Nissan 350Z. Now it seems like when you type in Infinity G35, you see takeover, and that's just a damn shame. Those that are out there that are building these cars, that have a lot of respect for these cars, they are incredibly good looking cars, and they're very capable vehicles that can do a lot. But we need to jump into why they're cheap to begin with. So the G-Line reported 65,000 units sold back in 2003, 72,000 in 2004, 68,000 in 2006, 72,000 in 2007, and so on, which was a lot. It was a lot more than what Infiniti even thought that they were gonna sell, especially here in the United States. They sold so well that there were months where the G35 sales were up and outperforming the Nissan Z sales at the same time. For instance, there was an 11.2% drop in 350Z sales in April of 2004 versus a 44% uptick in G35 sales at the same time. This continued throughout 2004. You saw it with 3,100 coupes selling versus 2,500 coupes selling. But overall, the 350Z sales in North America were a little bit short to the G35 sales that were launching in 2003. And what happened was it seemed like Nissan made a little bit of a mistake. The pricing model of the G35 was still more than Nissan, but it wasn't enough for people to really differentiate the two cars. And a lot of people ended up just making the jump to buying a G35 over a Nissan because it had a little bit of a nicer interior. It had some nicer finishes. It had more sound deadening material. And because of that, it was just a more luxury sports sports car. Now, the G line was so close to the 350Z, and because it was more refined, people that were buying it as their first car, their fifth car, or for a sports car, most of them made that jump to a G35. And it was really good. Like, I want to get into the fact that this is a longer wheelbase. I think the G35 Coupe, for instance, is right around 112 inches in terms of a wheelbase, which is about 8 inches longer than an E36 or E46 wheelbase, and it was even longer than a Corvette in terms of wheelbase. It's a long car, which meant it was really fun and good testing grounds for the growing motorsport known as Formula Drift. Team Falcon actually used an Infinity G35 in the early heydays of FD, which at the time, they ran 675 horsepower out of their car. It had the iconic livery, but overall, it was a really well-received car. Marketed super well. Nissan was doing a pretty good job back in the early 2000s with it. Throwing it into the drift community also made it a banger. So why do people call it a Skyline? Everybody on the internet, for some reason or another, they're not happy with the title that their car is given. They want to call it something else. It's not a 2 Series, it's an M240i. And then, oh, if the 4 and the 0 and the I happen to fall off, now all of a sudden I have an M2. I don't really get it. I don't like it. Either way, it's important to understand why, because there is some truth to calling an Infiniti G35 a Skyline. Now, in Japan, Nissan doesn't sell Infiniti, or at least at that time, they did not. It was the same thing with Lexus and Acura. They just sold their home brands of Nissan, Toyota, and Honda. Now, it's a horse apiece on who does this now because it has changed in international business. Everybody's doing it because you just make more money. But back then, they didn't. Right now, the Infiniti Q50 is a Nissan Skyline in Japan. So does that mean that you own a Nissan Skyline when you buy an Infiniti G35? And I would say not in the way that you think. So the history of this goes back to actually the R33 GTR, taking it all the way back to Le Mans. During this time, Nissan was seeing a lot of success with their GTR nameplate. Mostly everybody outside of Japan knew it as a GTR. They did not know it as a Nissan Skyline GTR. And because of that, Nissan started to take little efforts to differentiate the Skyline name from the GTR name, starting to launch the R33 GTR that was in Le Mans as the R33 GTR, not the Nissan Skyline R33 GTR. I don't know how many times I can say that in a sentence, but it's very similar to what Viper did, or what Dodge did with Viper. It's very similar to what Hyundai is doing with Genesis. It's the same thing that Chevy actually toyed around with just a few years ago in terms of differentiating the Corvette name away from the Chevy name. And that was because so many people start to tie into that GTR nameplate that they don't want the Skyline to become associated with just being a race car. They want the Skyline to be associated with being a sedan and also a performance car. And so what ended up happening with the Infiniti nameplate and the Skyline nameplate is they started to push the Skyline nameplate more into standard sedans and performance sedans and sometimes performance coupes, but they wanted that GTR or GTT nameplate to really be a sports car, a race car nameplate. And they started to split those two across. And so when you started getting into the late 90s, into the early 2000s, having a Skyline meant more like you had a family sedan more than it felt like you had a GTR. If that makes sense, hopefully it does. That's what Nissan had been trying to do. Skyline was more of a household name rather than it being a racing name, whereas the GTR nameplate was very much more a racing nameplate and not so much a sports car nameplate. So it is a Skyline, but not a performance Skyline like a GTR or GTT even. It's a Skyline in a way that it's a relatively more base model sports car. It's not Godzilla. My recommendation is don't rebadge it. Now, why are they takeover cars? I said in a video a while ago that the G35 is one of the cars that I would call is available in the car buffet. The car buffet was cars that are cheap, made in mass volume, and are usually in the first or second purchase of a car wanting a fun car. These cars look at a freshly legal 18-year-old up and down and they say, hey baby, let's mess up your car insurance. I promise I won't skip your freshly burnt Travis Scott CD of Utopia. The G35 is in that category, which means you are getting a lot of people that are picking up these kind of cars, and they come from all over the place, and they come from all different reasons as to why they'd want one. But because G35s are relatively untaken care of and they were made in such mass volume, it's made them very cheap, which means a lot of people can pick them up without having to take out a crazy loan. Here's the thing. The G35 coupes also came with some really good stuff from factory to do fun race car stuff or stupid shit. And it's important to recognize this. So 2004 to 2006 Sport package came with a limited slip differential, viscous limited slip differential, I believe it is. And that made the ability to slide around very, very easy in a car that you didn't need to swap anything on. 2007 Sport sedans came with the VLSD. The Base and Journey have the ABLS. 03 to 04 coupes had the limited slip differential if it came with a performance wheel and tire package option, which meant you also got the 18-inch wheels. From 05 to 07, coupes with the Sport suspension package came with the limited slip differential. But if you didn't have those, depending on the trim that you had, you might possibly have that option. It's a little bit confusing, isn't it? And that's the tough part with these cars. There's so many different sport trims and options that came on the G35 and 350Z, it's really hard to know what you have. But if you pair a limited slip differential with a manual transmission and a $3,500 marketplace ad, you have a car that can have a lot of fun without having to take care of any of it. And that is why these cars have fell into a little bit of a weird spot. But in my opinion, I take that as this is an excellent opportunity for you to own a car and do it right and get the best out of it that you possibly can. G35s are great cars if they're well maintained, if they're taken care of, and if you do the right car parts, which hopefully you'll get from martiniworks.com. Now, to modify one, it means standing out above the rest with a clean and proper car that's been taken care of. If you look at a purchase price of a G35 and you're like, that's a steal, you're probably going to be spending some time fixing paint, dealing with oil burning issues that happen, like a quart every 1,000 miles, clearing up those headlights, dealing with fender rust, fixing oil leaks. That's going to be the big thing. If you're getting some for a steal, you're going to pay for it somewhere on these cars. There's no such thing as a great deal on a G35. There's only an appropriate deal on a G35. Now, for mods, K&N Engineering Dual Typhoon short ram intake is going to be probably your best and most affordable option that is still name brand. I'd recommend picking those up. For coilovers, if you are going to do coilovers, you obviously can do air suspension too if you want to. But BC Racing BR coilovers, $1,100, very nice. You get adjustable damping, you get height controlled, independent of spring rate, you get everything that you need, plus they ride very, very well. HKS G35 dual high power titanium tip catback exhaust if you want to spend more money, or if you want something that's a little bit more affordable, the Infiniti titanium tip with high flow cats from Infiniti is also a good option. For wheels and tires, if you're looking for that, 19 by 9.5 and 19 by 10.5 front and rear, you'll want to run a staggered setup because the fenders can accommodate that. And for offset, typically we would see a 9.5 22 and a 10.5 22. Tire size 245/35 and 275/35 seems to do really well. Most staggered setups right now, depending on if you're trying to stay cost effective, are going to be probably Autohan. We did a big video on why Autohan is like the king of reps right now and how they've gotten so popular and why they have such a big lip. That's on the main channel. You can actually go check that out somewhere over here. If you want to hear opinions on Autohan, you can actually go subscribe to the Martini Works podcast channel where we talk about that in depth as well. But they do have a stranglehold on this. They have the perfect fitment for that. Otherwise, some other options if you're looking to spend up or spend down. Koenig has some decent options in that lineup. Stage Wheels also has a little bit more of a motorsport drift style wheel that I think looks really good on the 350Zs, and I think that could transfer to the Infiniti G35s, but the only thing to keep in mind is they only run 18s. With that being said, really the big thing with the G35 to avoid is mods. Best thing you can do to these cars is get them back to an OE looking setup, because the G35 in its stock format looks incredible. For some reason, those early 2000 G35s, they just have an issue with fading glass, especially headlights and taillights. Get that haze taken care of with some polish, a wax, a little bit of elbow grease. It can be a fun weekend project, and you're gonna have a really good looking car right off the bat. Add an intake, add an exhaust, and add a tune, and you're gonna be having a lot of fun with that 280 horsepower if you've got that manual or even automatic on your coupe G35. And finally, after that, your BC Racing coilovers are gonna tighten up how heavy that car feels, and then you're gonna also get some wheels and tires that are gonna make you feel like you got more traction. A lot of times with the wheels, I recommend going a little bit lighter if you can. For tires, I would always recommend Continental if it's your only car. If you're looking to do more sliding around, I'd recommend Nexen or Ironman tires. And if you're looking for a more track setup, I'd recommend Michelin Pilot Sport 4S's are gonna be your best way to go. But if you have any questions on the G35 platform, let us know. But let us know if there's a car we should talk about next. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm Alex Martini. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.